welcome to another episode of It's a History podcast. I am your host, Madison, and this week I am joined by Matthew Davis to talk about his most recent release, A Biography of a Mountain, The Making and Meaning of Mount Rushmore. 2025 marks the 100th anniversary of the dedication of Mount Rushmore, and Matthew's book explores the history of the land the mountain lives on, the man who designed Mount Rushmore, and how we interact with monuments today. So with that, let's get right into the conversation. So welcome back to another episode of It's a History podcast. I am your host, Madison, and today we are joined by Matthew Davis, and we are going to be talking about his most recent release. So Matthew, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Madison, for having me on. It's really wonderful to be here. So I am a writer. This is my second book, Biography of a Mountain, The Making and Meaning of Mount Rushmore. And my first book was about Mongolia, where I lived for 3 years as a Peace Corps volunteer. And for much of my professional life and literary writing life, I have focused a great deal on places and people different from me and from who I am. So I lived in Mongolia for a spell and wrote about that. I've lived in the Middle East and wrote a bit about that. I reported a lot about deaf Americans through Gallaudet University and their football team. And this project was sort of a way for me to engage with more distinctly American culture and sort of American politics and history in a way that I had not before. So I was excited to be able to do that. Obviously, in addition to writing, I founded and directed the International Literary Center at George Mason University for a number of years. And so, even though for much of my life, my gaze has been pointed outwards, this book allowed me the opportunity to focus a bit more on the United States.
That's awesome. So when it comes to writing this second book, what was it specifically about Mount Rushmore that brought you to that story and how you went about uncovering the process of your storytelling?
Yeah. So, in July 3rd, 2020, President Trump spoke at Mount Rushmore. And at that time, if you recall, we were really in the midst of two kind of national and international crises. One was COVID-19, and the other, at that point in the United States, there was the Black Lives Matter movement that was really allowing many Americans to question our history and the monuments and the memorials that have been and were erected to commemorate that history. And there was a lot, at that time, in July 3rd, 2020, I have two kids, and my second son, Henry, had just been born about a month ago. And so, my wife and I were very busy with our two kids, lockdown and COVID. And so we didn't really pay too much attention as to what was going on in the Black Hills of South Dakota that July 3rd, 2020. But when I read about Trump's speech there, he sort of gave a vision of American history that was very singular and definitive in terms of how he and much of the broader MAGA movement thought about the trajectory of American history and the monuments that were built to commemorate that history. And he, at that speech, he laid out two different kind of policy proposals. One was for people who defame or destroy or in any way mark different national memorials, that they would be subject to imprisonment. And the second was this idea of creating a garden of national heroes, which maybe we can get into a little bit later. But when I began to sort of read about that speech, I began to wonder why he decided to give it at Mount Rushmore. What was it about those four faces in the Black Hills of South Dakota that sort of framed that speech? And so I did, an initial kind of deep dive into Mount Rushmore and decided that there was a lot of material here to work with in terms of a project. And it wasn't simply his speech that made me want to research it. It was also, as I began to sort of learn more about the memorial and the Black Hills, I began to learn how Rushmore itself sort of really touches upon so many different foundational themes and myths of the United States and the stories we tell ourselves, right? Like these conflicts with Native Americans that have been so prominent throughout our nation's history. This idea of manifest destiny and the United States westward movement across the continent, the impact of the discovery of gold and how gold impacted the American West and the United States. And then even beyond that, these issues of how the Great Depression impacted communities across the United States, and also post World War II, really this really golden period of American influence and power, especially after we had came out victorious in the Cold War. I mean, Rushmore, in its ideas, in its construction, and sort of how we talk about it today, covers all that ground. And so for me as a writer, it just was a very interesting way to learn about so many of these myths and stories that we tell ourselves as a country. And as I began to sort of research it, I often thought to myself that I was writing a book about the past, right? I was writing a book of history about how Mount Rushmore came to be and how the memorial came to be and sort of its growth and influence today. But really, what I didn't realize at the time was what I was writing was a book about the present, because so many of the conversations that we have in the United States right now about what stories of history we tell, what kind of history we tell, how that history is memorialized, is stuff that I was sort of thinking about and researching, several years ago as I began this project. And I think it's really become as much a work about the present than it has about the past.
Yeah, when I was reading through the book, I really appreciated how you would have the portion about the past and then you would like interlace your interactions with the people who are living there now, people who are descendants of those who had been there at the time that the monument was being built, created. And I really appreciated how you were able to bridge the past and the present into one cohesive narrative. It made the read feel less like just how you had said, less just history and more how it's something that evolves over time and how we even think about it as time goes on, it changes. And I also was not aware of much about Mount Rushmore. Like, I know Mount Rushmore, it's got the four presidents on it. But beyond that, that was kind of the extent of my knowledge on it prior to reading your book. And it is kind of a great allegory for everything that has happened in the United States, like just in that one area. You've got so many different aspects of the history of the US that happened just in that one area. And you can see it go from the various treaties that didn't really mean anything at the time to the creation of the monument itself, the, kind of defacing of lands, the taking of lands, the Native Americans in the Dakotas not being able to vote until I think the 1950s is what?
In South Dakota, yeah.
Yeah, South Dakota.
North Dakota took a little bit of a different trajectory, but South
Mm-hmm.
Dakota, certainly that was the case. Yeah, I mean, what's interesting, it's funny to hear you to talk about this, because like for me, one of the things that has always fascinated me from a young age when I was in college was this idea. And I had this great writer named William Least Heat Moon, who was based out of Columbia, Missouri. I went to college at the University of Missouri. He came into a class one time and asked us to envision what the land we were sitting in at that time, a college auditorium, what the land was like, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 1,000,000 years ago. And that moment has always stuck with me, because I do think when we talk about the past, oftentimes, we're really talking about the present as well. And so how the present has been shaped by the past, and vice versa too. I mean, how the present shapes the past is something that we're seeing a lot of today, is, something that I, again, just became totally fascinated with in the reporting and researching of this book. And as you were saying too, I mean, I think as a reader, some of the best books that I love to read in nonfiction are books about things you think but that you don't really know. And this book certainly became that for me as a writer. And I hope that it becomes that way for readers of the book. And yeah, I mean, as you were saying, the land of the Black Hills of South Dakota has a very very fraught history that does sort of intersect with so many of the national themes that we have seen across the United States, for much of our 250 years of existence. And the treaties that you were alluding to, and much of that is a very important element to this story. And they were important at the time when they were signed, and they become even more important over over the course of hundreds of years. And, for the purpose of the book and for the purpose of the existence of Mount Rushmore, I mean, the two key elements to know are that, that the Black Hills for thousands of years have been occupied, lived in, used by dozens of Native American tribes. One scholar has referred to the Black Hills as a kind of a supermarket where people went for food, for clothing, for shelter, for medicine. That was all able to be utilized in the Black Hills. But the Black Hills were also, for many of these tribes, immensely spiritual, immense, landmarks that became places of ceremonies and vision quests. And so there was a practical element, but there's definitely a spiritual element. And that was definitely true of the Lakota Nation, who, came to see the Black Hills as their place of origin. They called the Black Hills the Paha Sapa or the He Sapa, which literally translates into Black Hills or Black Ridge, which is how we get the name for that area in South Dakota. But the Lakota also called the Black Hills the heart of everything that is. And that gives you an idea as to the fundamental importance of the Black Hills to the Lakota. And the Lakota were actually kind of newcomers to the Black Hills. I mean, they moved west in the 18th and 19th century and eventually found themselves as the most powerful empire in the Great Plains of the United States. I mean, they occupied a huge swath of land and were able to keep control of it through their use of horses and weapons. And they were economically very powerful through trade. And so the United States, as it moved west, as it wanted to move west, was going to be brushing up against the Lakota Nation. And they did so. And what ended up happening was that in 1851, the first Treaty of Fort Laramie was signed. And that treaty was not a very good treaty, but what it did was it ostensibly allowed Americans and Europeans who wanted to migrate west towards Oregon, towards California, along the Oregon Trail. It allowed them peaceful passage. So before that treaty was signed, there were skirmishes and conflicts between the Lakota and other Native American tribes and these settlers who were trying to move west. And so the U.S. government signed this treaty of Fort Laramie with many different tribes and allowed for safe passage of pioneers into the American West in exchange for annuities. The U.S. government paid out $50,000 a year for 50 years to these various tribes, and the Lakota were to receive $10,000 a year for 50 years. But more important than the money was the treaty sort of laid out the different land holdings of these different tribes, and the Lakota received an immense amount of land. I mean, it is, from the Missouri River to the Powder River to the Platte River. I mean, that was all Lakota land. And that, includes almost all of present-day South Dakota, including the Black Hills. So that was the initial treaty, the Treaty of 1851. That was, it was not very enforceable. There were a lot of strange language in terms of hunting grounds and who got what. And it began to dissipate shortly after it was signed. And what ended up happening is that when the Civil War was going on, the U.S. Didn't forget about the West, but the U.S. military obviously was focused elsewhere, and many settlers were not moving out that way as well. But there were still people who were searching for gold at that time, and in the late 1850s, gold was found in Colorado and Montana. And what happened was there was this trail that was built through the hunting grounds of the Lakota called the Bozeman Trail. And the Bozeman Trail took American settlers through the heart of Lakota country into present-day Montana, where there were gold fields. And the Lakota took great exception to that. And there was a lot of fighting between Lakota and between these Americans and Europeans who were trying to get to these gold fields. And after the Civil War, when the American military began to refocus its interests in the American West, they created a series of forts along the Bozeman Trail, and that really upset the Lakota. And so they began what is today called Red Cloud's War, which was led by the great Lakota leader, Red Cloud. And Crazy Horse, a very prominent Lakota military leader, was also important in this war. And they began to attack these forts along the Bozeman Trail and really gave the United States more than they can handle. There was a massacre in late 1866 called the Fetterman Massacre, which, there were almost about 100 U.S. soldiers that were killed by Lakota warriors, and so the United States decided to sue for peace. They did not want to engage in war anymore with the Lakota, and so eventually the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty was signed, and that is the most important treaty that Lakota point to today, because that treaty really spelled out in very concrete detail that the Black Hills and the area that is Western South Dakota today was Lakota land, and that no Americans could go into that land except for official government expeditions. What happened was that treaty held up for about 5 years or so. President Ulysses S. Grant was a big supporter of the treaty. He was adamant that Americans not enter the hills. But in 1873, there was a financial panic in the United States. It's oftentimes referred to as the original Great Depression. And, markets cratered, credit lines dried up, companies went bankrupt, unemployment soared, all the elements, that mark different financial crises from that point onwards in our country. And both the morale of the country and the finances of the country were not good. And that's the backdrop for this 1874 expedition that George Armstrong Custer led through the Black Hills. And the U.S. military set up that expedition ostensibly to find a fort in the Black Hills, or to find a fort where the U.S. military could build in that area. But everyone knew that really the expedition was hoping to find gold. And they found gold. They found gold along the French Creek in the Black Hills, just outside of what is now Custer, South Dakota. And once that gold was found, it became increasingly more difficult for President Grant to restrain miners and other Americans from entering into the Black Hills. And eventually he gave up and he said, okay, go ahead, go to the Black Hills. And then Grant ordered all the Lakota, all the Native Americans that were in that area of land given to them by the Fort Laramie Treaty to report to reservations, and to stop sort of, being outside the reservation areas, to go to the reservations. And he threatened those that did not, that they would be rounded up basically and brought to these reservations. And so he sent the military out to do that. And that is where, you have this epic battle in June 1876 that Americans called the Battle of Little Bighorn, and that the Native Americans called the Battle of Greasy Grass, where Custer led his 7th Cavalry against a pretty strong contingent of Lakota and Northern Cheyenne warriors, and Custer got slaughtered. The Lakota won that battle decisively. Custer, of course, was killed. Many in his 7th Cavalry were also killed. And when word reached the east about that battle in Montana, Little Bighorn is in Montana, the United States government, who was busy celebrating the centennial of the founding of the United States, became irate and basically, tore up the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, and annexed the Black Hills for the United States in February of 1877. And from that moment on, South Dakota land and became Dakota territory, and the Black Hills became in American hands. And it led to a really traumatic decades of for the Lakota and for broader Native American communities. We're talking, Wounded Knee in 1890, their land being carved up, being put in reservations, boarding schools where Native American children, Lakota children were sent to. So that is how the land came into American hands. And that's sort of the backdrop of how Mount Rushmore.
Yeah, I think fundamentally, like the concept of the treaties, even the creation of them, because the two opposing sides have very different understandings and beliefs when it comes to land ownership, what the land is used for, that to even come to any type of consensus on how the land would be split up or given. I think that it's just two very different competing mindsets, that the thought that a treaty would be successful long term. I mean, it shows it didn't last. It was 1860 to 1873. That's not a very long time for a
Well,
treaty to
this obviously was nothing new in
last.
American history. I mean, the United States government was notorious for creating treaties and then
Yeah.
just disregarding them. And I think there's in fact so you have the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, and in
Hmm.
1877 there's not another treaty. It's basically it's called the Many Penny Agreement, where
Yeah.
the United States got 10% of Lakota male signatures to sign over the land of the Black Hills, which, according to the 1868 treaty, you needed to get three-quarters of the adult male signatures. They got 10%, but that was good enough for them. But basically, what's happening is that like it's at a certain point between 1868 and 1877, the U.S. government makes it an official policy not to do any more treaties with Native Americans. They're just like,
Yeah.
we're done doing treaties with them. We're just going to sort of have a different approach. And yeah, I mean, one of the things I talk about in my book is, as you were saying, Madison, like for Americans, those treaties didn't really matter a whole lot, but for Native Americans and for the people of the Lakota Nation, they matter a great deal. And like it is that sort of it's a clarion call, like the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty is for many people in South Dakota who are of Native descent, because it's throughout world history or throughout American history, the United States has wanted to have it both ways, right? They want to be
Hmm.
a land of laws and treaty, but yet they will they will disavow what they have promised when it suits them, and so there's a great deal of pain that's regarded from the violation of that specific treaty.
Yeah. A lot of do as I say, not as I do when it
Right,
comes
exactly,
to
exactly.
creating those treaties and agreements. So now we know how the U.S. has South Dakota and the Black Hills. I think we should probably go into a little bit about Gutzon Borglum and maybe some of his history and how he ended up being a part of how Mount Rushmore came to be.
Yeah. So this is actually one of my favorite parts of the story, because I think that there's a preconceived idea that Mount Rushmore was created by the federal government to become this sort of political monument in the middle of the country, and that's not the case. Like the winding nature of Mount Rushmore is what I think is most interesting to me in terms of its origin story. And Borglum obviously played a vital role in all this, and I'll get to him in a second. But like in the 1920s, South Dakota was suffering an economic crisis that presaged the Great Depression. Their commodities had gone through the roof during World War One, and when World War One ended, the prices tanked, and many banks foreclosed. Farmers had to give up their land, and there was a state historian named Doane Robinson who was kind of a jack of all trades, a Renaissance man, interested in lots of different ideas. He wanted to improve South Dakota's economy and make it less reliant on agriculture. So he had this idea to carve a sculpture in the Black Hills, and his idea was to carve, figures that were associated with the American West. His first idea was to put the great Lakota leader Red Cloud on one of the pinnacles of the Black Hills, and he pursued a different artist to do this, a guy named Laredo Taft, who was a very prominent sculptor based in Chicago. And Taft didn't obviously do this. He passed on the opportunity, and I always wonder what would have happened if Taft had said yes, what Rushmore would be today. So when Taft passed, Doane Robinson began looking for another sculptor, and he found who he was looking for in Gutzon Borglum, and Borglum is a totally fascinating character. He was Mormon, born into a Mormon family in Idaho, what became Idaho. And his dad had immigrated from Denmark to the United States and moved around a lot, he and his family. And since he was Mormon, Gunson's dad had two wives. They were sisters, Ida and Christina Mickelson. And Ida was Christina was Gunson's mom, but Christina was Gunson's dad's second wife. And so what happened was you had this first wife named Ida and the second wife named Christina. And as the family moved from the Western United States back to the Midwest, and then a little bit further east by east, I mean sort of St. Louis at this point, Mormonism was looked down upon, and the family knew they could not be in a polygamous marriage. And so basically, Gutzon Borglum's father, Jens, who had 5 children with 2 different women, had to let one of his wives go. And he let his younger wife, Christina, left her behind when the family moved to St. Louis. And so Gutzon Borglum's mom, who was also the mother of Gutzon's younger brother, Solon, she was forced out of the family. And so Gutzon Borglum was raised, though he had his aunt Ida, who was claimed to be technically his mother. His real mother, he never saw again after being a young boy. And Borglum grew up in the middle United States, and he very quickly fell into art. There are some amazing sketches of his in notebooks from when he was a schoolboy in Nebraska, and he moved to Los Angeles with his family in the 1870s, 1880s, and really developed his skills as an artist, and had the great fortune of meeting this woman named Jessie Fremont. And Jessie Fremont was the wife of this very prominent general and politician named John Fremont. And Jessie Fremont, encouraged Gutzon Borglum to immigrate to Europe to really focus on his art. And he took her advice. And so he left to go to Europe in 1891 and was there for about a decade. Developed his skills as an artist. He transformed himself from a painter into a sculptor. He was heavily influenced by the French sculptor Auguste Rodin. And when he moved back to the US in 1901, he knew he wanted to pursue sculpture full time. And he became very interested in public monuments, which at that time were both ways for artists to make a living, getting these commissions, and also an outlet for them to create. Borglum he was very political. He had developed over the course of decades a very firm idea of how the United States should be and what its art should be. And the key moment in Borglum's life came in the mid 1910s, 1915, 1916, when he was asked to build Stone Mountain, the Confederate memorial in Atlanta, Georgia. And the history of that memorial is really, really fascinating. And basically, how it came to be was there was a film called Birth of a Nation that came out in 1915 that championed the Ku Klux Klan, and sort of, was a film that gave a great deal of credit to the KKK for kind of saving the United States, saving the South in many ways. It began this revival of Confederate history and Confederate monuments and memorials. And there was an older woman there in Atlanta named Helen Plain, who wanted to build a memorial to the Confederacy on Stone Mountain in Atlanta, and just outside of Atlanta. And she asked Gutzon Borglum to do that work, and he did. And when Borglum got the job, the idea for Stone Mountain expanded beyond Helen Plain's wildest imaginations. And the other key element to this part of the story is that the KKK was reborn atop of Stone Mountain shortly after the film was released. The film inspired the rebirth of the KKK. And so from its very earliest stages, the Stone Mountain Confederate Memorial and the KKK were deeply intertwined. And Gutzon Borglum stepped into that project and had to build relationships, and chose to build relationships with the newly reborn Ku Klux Klan. And he did that swimmingly. He became very close with the KKK. He introduced the KKK's leaders to the President of the United States, different politicians. And, it's important to remember that in the 1920s and late 1919s, the KKK was not thought of as the way it was, 50 years prior. It was sort of a mainstream American organization that did have a lot of representation in politics and in judicial branches and business leaders. And, though it was still very much racist and xenophobic and a political terrorist sort of organization, it was very much accepted in the mainstream in the South, especially at that time. So Borglum, was working on Stone Mountain, and he was going through some struggles there, and sort of the way that he was engaged in his relationship with the KKK. There was some power struggles, some financial struggles, and Don Robinson saw the work he was doing and said, "What we need is Gutzon Borglum to come and do our project here in the Black Hills." So Robinson wrote to Borglum, and Borglum saw this as a way to expand his ideas of American monuments, and sort of pair Stone Mountain with Mount Rushmore. And he was never really given that specific opportunity because he was fired from Stone Mountain before he began work at Mount Rushmore, which did two things. One, it sort of raised the stakes for Borglum and Mount Rushmore. He had sort of failed in Stone Mountain, and he couldn't fail in Mount Rushmore, but it also made him want to create a national memorial at Mount Rushmore that was imbued with a great deal of politics. Borglum envisioned and thought the United States was sort of the apotheosis of Western civilization, Western political society. And he wanted to create a monument that was on par with what you would see at the Parthenon in Greece, the pyramids in Egypt. He wanted it to last forever, and he wanted to be representative of what the United States had come to represent for him. So that's what he set out to do. And he did bring a lot of the baggage with him from Atlanta. I mean, there's not, I have never seen any, clear relationship between Borglum and the KKK after he left Atlanta and began work on Mount Rushmore. But clearly the KKK still thought of him as one of their own as he began to sort of build what became Mount Rushmore.
Yeah, I wonder if this would just be speculation, if he just associated with the KKK just to pursue more of his art, or I know he had opinions that aligned with the KKK a little bit more than others, but if his initial and prolonged association, because he did, I think you had mentioned in your book that he did say, "I am not a member of the KKK," like publicly or written, but if it was kind of a means to an end sort of situation.
I think it was a bit of both. I mean, I think Borglum knew what he was doing. He knew that in the North, for example, that the KKK was an organization that was looked upon unfavorably. He knew that if he wanted to get Stone Mountain funded, he would need to cozy up to the KKK. But he also shared a lot of the political sentiments that the KKK held, and some of those sentiments, were terrible. They were anti-Semitic and they were xenophobic, and he was very anti-immigrant. He was racist. But some of those, political ideologies were right on par with very progressive ideas, the championing of the individual against big systems, whether they be government systems or business systems, or from Borglum's perspective, artistic systems. Like he championed the little guy, right? He was a support of them. And in fact, before he was part of the and sort of enmeshed himself with the KKK, Borglum was party to different very left progressive organizations who, especially with regards to farmers, right? He was a big supporter of farmers against, what he saw as governmental overreach. And so and that's what's complicated about him. He's not easy to pigeonhole.
He's not a one note person. Like he's got,
no, he's not.
He's got very differing things happening in his life.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Which makes him, from a writer's perspective, just a completely fascinating person to try to write about.
I've lived in Florida most of my life, so Florida is a little bit different than other southern states. It's one of those, the more north you go in Florida, the more south it gets. And I'm about right in the middle of Florida. So some of the, even I went to, grade school in the thousands and the 2010s. And some of the sentiments that came from this reinvigoration of the KKK, trying to change the narrative of the Civil War time period, that was still evident when I was going to school. And it was really only recently, like some of the things that like I had learned about when I was in grade school that I was like, this just doesn't seem right. And like doing some like, reading on my own as I've, went to college and I'm out of college, like some of these things, I needed to like reconnect the dots on what I had learned. Even with Stone Mountain, I had heard about that probably in high school, and it was kind of just like a passing, thing. It wasn't really we didn't really talk about how it was like a, Confederate monument. It was just supposed to be like a monument, nothing that was like something to be proud about the Confederacy. It was just something that was there and was like something that, it was something to be created. It didn't end up working out, and that was it. Like even in college, I have friends that went to Robert E. Lee High School. Like it's still very prominent in and around where I am.
Absolutely. And I mean, one of the more interesting experiences I had doing this book was visiting Stone Mountain and just seeing how prominent the homage to the Confederacy is. As someone who has not spent a lot of time in the South, as someone whose narratives of the Civil War and what that meant and means are very different than what's expressed at Stone Mountain, it was kind of shocking to see a lot of how that time period is framed. And Borglum's work at Stone Mountain was ultimately blown up, and he
Mhm.
he's not really a part of it contemporarily. But certainly the idea that you just expressed about looking at uh, this sort of historical revisionism that takes place around the Civil War and sort of the monuments that were erected to celebrate the Confederacy, and that quite frankly are being re-erected today. I mean, I think that's the other element to this, and another reason why this book, though it's about the past, is very much about the present, because in addition to sort of talking about Rushmore, what I'm trying to get at is how we as a country memorialize history, right? And I think the narratives we tell and the stories we tell and who tells them and where they're told, all that stuff is very important to how monuments are created and how they're interpreted today and how that changes.
I have one more aside. I grew up in a town specifically called Brooksville, and they every year they would have a reenactment of the Brooksville raid, and it was a from the Civil War, and it was the Confederate soldiers and the Union soldiers, and it wasn't until I chaperoned my younger brother on the field trip that I was like, I don't. This is more about the Confederacy than the Union. And it actually has since stopped. Probably the last one I think was in 2019 because it was a summer event. So it has since stopped, but it wasn't until I was in like my later high school I was like, wait a second, this is about the Confederacy and not the Union. I went and I was seeing it with like, I wasn't an adult, but I had, older teenage eyes. And I was like looking at what they were I don't know what they were portraying. I was like, this is a little crazy that this is still happening in, the late 2010s. It's something that I am curious to see as we, just move forward into the future, how these types of things evolve even further. But we can get back to Mount Rushmore now because I think it's time for us to get back to the Black Hills.
Okay. Let's leave Confederate South and head back to the Black Hills of South
Yes.
Dakota.
Do we want to get into maybe how Mount Rushmore itself, like after Borglum got there, like
Sure,
how we
how it
even got
came.
to get into putting faces into the mountain? Because that
Yeah, yeah,
is a
sure.
crazy thing to want to try to do.
Yeah, so I mean, so Borglum came to the Black Hills in 1924 for the first time, and October 1st, 1925 was almost 100 years ago. Was when the memorial was first dedicated, and that dedication was led by Borglum, and it was attended. What was pretty widely attended. About 3,000 people were there from the Black Hills in a time when there were no roads up to the memorial. People had to ride horses up there, walk up there. It was this mountain called Mount Rushmore, and how that mountain became Rushmore is fascinating in and of itself. It was named after this lawyer, New York City lawyer, who was in the Black Hills to represent tin mine corporations, in the 1880s, I think it was. And he just happened to name the mountain after himself, or people named it after him. And so they began, at that point to seriously move forward with the memorial. And the construction of Mount Rushmore is really it's a story of starts and stops, of an inability to get funding for the memorial, of Borglum sort of stepping on his own feet and really hurting his chances to get support and money. But the way that the memorial came to be constructed was, so you had this initial dedication in 25, and nothing really happened for a couple of years. They were raising some money, but nothing substantive was really happening. Then 1927, Calvin Coolidge, who was president of the United States at the time, needed a place to summer because the White House was going to be undergoing some construction. And he ultimately settled on the Black Hills of South Dakota as his vacation spot that summer. And Borglum and the South Dakota politicians he was working with knew this was their chance to sort of really get the U.S. government involved in this project, and it worked. They invited Coolidge to speak at the mountain, and that day in August, it was August of 1927, and when this happened, that was the actual first time that construction began on the memorial. So these drill bits were sort of inserted into the mountain. From 27 to about the time when FDR was elected and came into office, construction of Mount Rushmore was a really slow process. There was legislation that was passed to aid in the construction of the memorial, but that money was only given when they were able to raise private funds. It was matching funds. And so there were whole years when nothing happened at Mount Rushmore. And there were other years when they had more money and could work. Ultimately, Borglum moved to the Black Hills and brought his family there and sort of began to oversee much of the construction there. I think initially he had hoped he would not have to do that, but he did. And he began, so much of Borglum's thinking initially in 1925 was sort of how to represent this idea of American expansion. And he began to sort of, think about the presidents that he wanted on that memorial, and came to the four that he did because of how they came to sort of see American growth, right? So you had Washington, who was the founder of the country, Jefferson with the Louisiana Purchase, sort of expanding the country, Lincoln preserving the country, and then Theodore Roosevelt, who was a friend of Borglum's. He was on there because of the way that he united the country, was what Borglum considered it, in terms of the Panama Canal and sort of linking this continent that was the United States was on. And so that's how the four presidents were chosen. And then it was just a matter of finding the funding to do this, which ultimately FDR was a huge champion of Rushmore, and provided Borglum with the finances and control that Borglum wanted. And so it was really in the 1930s, in the heart of the Great Depression, using unskilled workers that were largely unemployed miners in the Black Hills, many of whom knew each other or related to each other, that this memorial came to exist. And the process by which it was built, was basically Borglum sculpted a larger maquette, is what it's called, that came to represent what he wanted to actually appear on the mountain. And so he sculpted this in a studio, and it was always changing, always being modified. But ultimately, that was what they used as a base to then transpose onto the mountain, using a classical system called the pointing system, where you match inches to feet on the mountain. And so there were skilled workers called pointers, whose job it was to sort of measure exactly on the maquette, and then measure exactly on the mountain where the different eyes and nose and lips and everything else was going to go. And then for the actual construction of the memorial itself, they used a lot of dynamite. They blew a lot of portions of the mountain off to get to carvable stone. And then they would sort of use smaller amounts of dynamite to make it, more fine-tuned. And then when they got to the real stone that they wanted to, that's something they would use the jackhammers and the bumpers and really get into the details that you see today. And so it was a long process. It was one that, by our standards would be impossible to do today, because now you would image a mountain and you'd have all these scientific numbers, and you'd have an idea of what you were dealing with. Borglum was doing this largely on faith. He really had no idea this was going to work out, but it did, and I think that's one of the astonishing things about it, is that it was actually that it was able to work. And that it's Borglum was a great artist, depending on what you think about him as a figure, because he was a terrible boss and he was a terrible manager of money, and his politics were sometimes controversial. But he was a great artist, and he was able to create this sculpture out of this mountain. And I think it's really it's not his best work of art by any means. I think there are others that are much more touching and provocative and profound than Rushmore, but it's really hard to do what he did, and he was able to manage to create that memorial. It took him a long time. It took him over 16, 17 years until it took him through his death, right? He died before he was able to see it complete, but he was able to get it done.
Yeah, the scale of it is quite large, and I like to do like I like to crochet. Like I can like see a project out like in my head, but like I just can't fathom being able to see something on that scale, that to for it to first to even be able to think that you could do it, and then for it to actually work out and it look like they look like the people they're supposed to look like. I just I think that his skill as an artist is, yeah, with all that you said, that he, as a controversial person, being able to do that is just still something that not very many people have the ability to do that.
Or the stamina. I mean, and I think it's important to note too that, I mean, in addition to Stone Mountain being important for how Borglum came to get the job at Mount Rushmore and what Mount Rushmore ultimately came to represent for
Mhm.
him, it was also critical in terms of the skills he learned to carve into a mountain, because Stone Mountain was very similar
Mhm.
to Rushmore in that way. It was a granite mountain, and so at Stone Mountain, Borglum learned how to use dynamite. He learned how to work outdoors. He learned how to deal with complicated local politics. He learned how, to transpose a idea of a face, onto a mountain. And so I think, for all those reasons, Stone Mountain was vital. And yeah, I mean, I think he was able to finish this. But I think it's also like really instructive to understand that uh, that is not how most public memorials today are built. I mean, he was a singular sort of driver of all this. No one weighed in and sort of like, maybe you should think about doing this. It was all his ideas. It was sort of
Yeah.
his process. His son Lincoln Borglum was instrumental in helping him both carve the memorial, but also Lincoln was a much softer personality than Gutzon was. And so whereas, Gutzon was notorious for going to the memorial and firing five men because of mishaps he perceived they had made, Lincoln would then say, no, you're not fired, let my dad blow off some steam, but come back to work the next day. And so they had a real yin and yang presence at the memorial. And if Gutzon was the fire behind it, then Lincoln was sort of the cooler head that enabled it to sort of be finished. And in fact, when Gutzon died in March of 1941, it was Lincoln who took over for his father and managed to finish it to the best of its ability. But what was interesting is, though FDR was its biggest champion as president, it became clear to FDR in the late 1930s that the United States was headed towards some serious military conflicts, and I think he began to winnow down the funding for Rushmore. And Borglum wanted, before he died in Chicago, and Borglum was actually on his way to Washington to try to drum up another hundreds of thousands of dollars for the memorial so he can finish some elements that he wanted to. But FDR knew that the money would needed to be used for war, and so he denied the financial requests. And Lincoln Borglum finished the memorial to the best of his ability with the money that was left over. And the memorial is really not finished today. I mean, if you go there and check it out, there's a bunch of rubble that hasn't been cleared off. There was initially going to be a big hall of records that was going to, tell the story of the memorial and of the United States. That's not complete. There's different elements to the faces that are not complete, but Lincoln was able to do it to the best of his ability, and the Mountain Memorial was finished in October 1941, just 5-6 weeks before the U.S. was attacked at Pearl Harbor. And the at that time, what happened is that the memorial then became this real significant representation of the United States and its democracy. And it's now called the Shrine of Democracy, in large part because of when it was finished and how it came to represent the U.S. during World War II and then the Cold War after, and sort of has maintained that sort of essence of its meaning for decades, and now is a bit more controversial than it was just 25 years ago.
Yeah, I think that gives us a great segue to talk about the evolving impression of Mount Rushmore, and even how the Lakota now, like their descendants, they feel about the monument. And you want to just get into that part of the story?
Yeah, sure. So, my book starts with me going to Mount Rushmore in July 2022, but it quickly then moves back in time into 2000 when I first saw the memorial. But this is before 9/11, before the controversial elections of November 2000. And, at that time, the memorial was largely what Borglum had intended it to be. It was a place that tourists stopped over and was imbued with patriotism. It was a sense of pride of the United States. And at that time, there was nothing at the memorial that would give you any indication that the Black Hills for thousands of years had been the home of many Native American tribes, that the Black Hills were a sacred area to Native Americans. And that began to change a bit in 2004 when Gerard Baker came as a superintendent of Mount Rushmore. And he was a Native American himself from the Mandan Hidatsa tribe and began to introduce different Native American elements and themes to Mount Rushmore that still exist today. But beginning in the 1970s, even before that, I should say that even before the 1970s, but really when the 60s and 70s, when there came to be more of a Native American rights movement, and many people became more conscientious that Rushmore was built in this sacred land of the Lakota and other Native communities, and that treaties had been broken for Rushmore to be placed where it is. And many today in the Lakota Nation and other Native American communities, and just Americans more broadly, view Mount Rushmore as not so much an homage to American exceptionalism, but an homage to America's manifest destiny, and sort of the genocide that took place to Native tribes and communities across the continent when Europeans came and the United States was formed. And so it's very controversial for many Native Americans and other Americans as well, who see the memorial as I don't know if I can swear in this podcast or not, but as kind of a fuck you to the Lakota Nation and to other Native communities whose lives were totally upended by American movement west. So there's that element to it that's very controversial. And then, of course, there's still today a strong element of the military that's involved in Mount Rushmore. Many veterans go to Rushmore to be honored and to honor their service, and people who have died fighting overseas, or people who are veterans. There's that element to it. And then what has happened recently is with Trump's speech there in July 2020, and today, with Republicans in Congress introducing legislation to put Trump on Mount Rushmore, it has become a real flashpoint in these conversations we're having about American history and how you memorialize American history and how you think about American history. And Trump sort of started that in 2020 when he went there to speak and gave that speech that first made me want to write this book. But it's even more so today. I mean, I think that one of the things Rushmore struggles against is whether it can be a memorial that is for all Americans or whether it's a memorial that's sort of locked into the MAGA movement and the more conservative movement. And certainly, my book ends with a ceremony that takes place at Rushmore, a naturalization ceremony that my dad and I went to in June 2023. And that ceremony really offers, I think, a vision of how the memorial can both be something that Americans can be proud of, but also understand that there is a very complicated story here that needs to be told if you want to understand the full breadth of the history of this mountain and the memorial that has been built inside of it, or on top of it, I should say, not inside of it.
I've grown up in just the 2000s. I'm a 99 baby. So whenever I've thought about Mount Rushmore, like as, it's like I learn about it or like even as I was a teenager and even as the like the, national parks are very important and the don't leave anything behind. Even before like really looking into it, like just that that they did do that to that mountain, like that they actually like took pieces of it away instead of putting something else on top of it, like creating something else and putting it in the area. Like they actually like took away from the mountain instead of adding to it. That was something that I kind of always had feelings about. I wasn't like that definitely could not happen today. That is not something that that I think anyone would do today. And then also that monuments and like these various memorials, like they are not just singular entities that they mean one thing. Like they are things that I might feel something different about it. You might feel something different about it. My neighbor might feel something different about it. They all have different meanings, and you can't just acknowledge your own feeling about it. Like you have to be able to recognize what the other perspectives are around it. Like you can't just look at it for what you think. You have to be able to contextualize and see how these different monuments and like statues, like how someone else might perceive it, and then also be able to work with your own feelings on that and not make it a whole thing.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I think that's an important element to this, right? Is and allowing for those different interpretations to exist. That's something that we have a hard time doing in this country right now. I think people want to sort of say this is how things are, and this is, if you don't agree with me, then you're just, there's something wrong with you. And I think when I myself talk about the complexity of Rushmore, I think it's twofold. I think it's one, understanding its complicated history and how the memorial came to be and why it's there, but it's also understanding that people have widely different interpretations of what it means to them today, and that each of those interpretations are valid to some degree, right? And I think that that's whether you agree with them or not, I think you have to sort of allow those people to have those kinds of feelings and sentiments. And it's a reminder too, I think, that like I think one of the things that we tend to forget is that even though public monuments and memorials that are representative of history, whether they're figures or ideas or whatever, they're carved in immutable materials, usually like stone or bronze or whatever, but their meanings evolve. And when they're created and how they're created are oftentimes just as important as what their meanings are decades down the line, and where they're built is extremely important. All that stuff, and so you can't just sort of lock into a singular meaning of any memorial, whether it's you know whether it's Mount Rushmore or the Statue of Liberty or Stone Mountain or the Lincoln Memorial or the Washington Monument. I mean, all of these public sculptures that are intended to represent different people or periods of American history should always evolve. I mean, that's history evolves, right? It's never something that's just locked in and that's that. So I think, it's important for memorials to have the space to do that.
Yes, I definitely agree. They are products of their time, but we should also be able to look upon them as both products of their time and how their meanings change over time. Like two truths can happen at the same time.
Yes. Yes.
All right. Well, I think that brings us to the end here. Is there anything else you want to add before we say goodbye?
I don't. So I think, yeah, I think we covered a lot of ground. Is there anything else you want to know before we say goodbye?
I we talked for quite a while. I will say this is one of the longest
Longer ones.
conversations
Okay.
I've had. Yeah.
But thank you so much for having me on this, and I really appreciate it. And yeah, I look forward to hearing this when it comes out.
Thank you, Matthew, for coming on and talking about our book. We are looking forward to having others read it. Is there anywhere that we can find you online or more information about the book?
You can definitely buy the book through any online bookseller, whether it's Bookshop or Amazon or Barnes and Noble. You can find it in local bookstores, and you can find me at my website, MatthewDavisWriter.com.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Madison. Appreciate it.
Thank you again to Matthew for coming on the show and sharing the story with us. I really enjoyed this book, and I know you guys will enjoy it too. The book is out now, and I will be including links below if you want to find this book for yourself. Thank you again for listening to this week's episode. If you liked what you heard, please head to Spotify or Apple Podcasts and leave a review. If you have any questions, comments, or topic ideas, feel free to email me at itsahistorypodcast@gmail.com. Thank you again for listening to this week's episode, and I hope to have you in the next one.